Hi everyone, my name is Coach Meabh and today I'm going to talk to you and do some emotion analysis for the motion this house will give more welfare to students who perform academically strong at school or well at school. Perfect. So there's a couple of things that I want to do here. First of all, I want to talk about the model and then I want to run through a couple of arguments for side government and side opposition. Number one, for the model, I think this is key for this debate for side government because when we're talking about what is academic success, I think it's really easy to visualize that as being you getting an A in an exam or an A in a different module or part of the curriculum. But I don't think that's the route that I would go down if I were on site government. I would also include, as well as doing just generally really well, I would also include relative improvement and relative growth for each student. So for instance, the government can look and see that a student, perhaps in the past, was consistently getting C's in maths and English and science, and now they have risen their level to a B. I would also include that as they would also be eligible for this reward and for this extra welfare. The reason that I would include this in my model is that there's obviously some students who are never going to be able to get A's no matter how hard they try, and we can understand this, and different people have different academic abilities and they have different strengths outside of school. But what we want to do is we want to ensure that when side opposition says, well, not everyone is capable of getting A's, so this debate seems very unfair on them, we want to have preempted that in our model by saying we will still reward their relative improvement, and we think that nearly everyone has the capacity to relatively improve. Even if that means, for instance, there's often higher level courses and ordinary level courses, even if that means within the ordinary level course that you're still doing better than you were before. So that's the first thing that I would say in terms of setting up this debate and the core thing that I will be modeling there. Okay, so what can we argue then on side government? There's three different strands of argumentation that I would be pursuing if I were on side government. Number one, arguments about how this changes the child's behaviour and motivates them. Argument number two, how it motivates the parent and changes the parent's behaviour. And then argument number three is a little bit more challenging. Honestly, I would try to make an argument that is a little bit more out there, that is a little bit more unexpected. And the reason is it's very easy for the other team to preempt these standard arguments about how it changes the child's behaviour, changes the parent's behaviour. So I would do something a bit unusual in argument number three and have a bit of fun, and we'll get onto that in just a minute. But first of all, in terms of how it would motivate the child, look, I think that a lot of government teams are likely to argue that this will motivate the parents, and we are going to get onto that in a second. But I think it's also key to frame it that the child themselves will want to change their behaviour. There's a couple of different reasons that we can add for this. Number one, they just don't like being in poverty, but potentially it stresses them out. Potentially they want to help their family. They like this reward of getting rewarded for their hard work. They're likely to work even harder than they were before. The second thing that you can say is a lot of families who are low income or who are in poverty can't afford to reward their students as much as they would like. So for instance, if the kid for Christmas wants a new Xbox, that's probably something that's unlikely that the parents can give them under the status quo if they're very low income, but actually the parents could use this extra welfare money and they could potentially even spend it on the child and reward the child in that way, or even give them smaller rewards that would make the child very happy. So even if it's small things like the child really wants to take a guitar class, but the parents can't afford a guitar class, now they can, that's a big motivating difference. Why are we bothering to make arguments of how this would motivate the child? Well, again, everything that we should be thinking about should be relative to the opposition. I think that a lot of the opposition is going to say the child is going to be put under undue pressure. The parents are going to pressure the child to get these higher grades that the child doesn't even want. I think that flipping this and trying to say the child themselves will be the one who is motivated, the parents won't have to push them very much at all, I think that is something that really helps you inside government to neutralise some of that point from side opposition. So that's the first argument that I'd make. The second argument that I would make on side government is that it motivates the parents. Now, you have to be careful with this argument because we're characterising people who are on welfare and who are receiving government help, but what you don't want to do is to frame them all as being bad parents or being poor, because that can be quite offensive and it's just not very good argumentation. So I would break the stakeholder down into a couple of different stakeholders. Number one, there might be parents who are overwhelmed under the status quo. So they're working really hard and really long hours. They have other kids that they need to take care of. So they're just not maybe paying as much attention to their child's educational successes as they ought to be, or failures. And now this new policy motivates them and reorients their priorities back to their child's education, and that's very, very important. I don't think that that is an offensive argument to make. The second one is that it even rewards parents who are trying their best, the parents who are working full shifts day in and day out, and then who are spending extra time helping their kids and helping their kids with their homework and so on, that they deserve a reward, and this is rewarding them. And then third of all, there is, and you are then allowed to also talk about parents who maybe are disinterested, maybe they're not very good parents, maybe they don't care very much whether their child is absent from school, if they're cutting classes, if they're acting out in class, but they are motivated by extra welfare, they are motivated by money, and that these parents then would get more involved and would actually see the trade-off if their child isn't doing well in school and discipline them more, for instance, or motivate them more. I think that this is some parents, but I wouldn't say it's all parents, but we can include them as part of it. I also think that you can add in here that it's not just the parent is incentivized to change their behavior, but they're more capable of supporting their child. So for instance, if the family is getting more welfare, it probably creates a virtuous cycle where there's less stress at home, that the family can afford, let's say, even potentially more food, they can afford to heat their home better, they can afford more tutoring and so on. So there's a virtuous cycle where upon getting more welfare, they can even do even better in the future. And that's another thing that increases the educational standard. So this is all sorts of types of arguments about how the parents will change their behaviour once this policy exists. What I will be saying outside government is a lot of these parents, before the child even starts doing well, the parents will change their behaviour in anticipation of this. They will try to get interested, they will try to support their child, they will invest in tutoring and so on, with the hopes of getting rewarded for that. Excellent. So it's actually not contingent on the child actually receiving the high grade, but it's more that the parents will actually try and get them to get the high grade. Argument number 3 for site government is a little bit wacky, so bear with me. But I would be trying to argue that just more welfare is really, really good. It's really, really good for any family who gets it. But I would be trying to say that it's often very, very difficult for politicians to give families more welfare. This is often something that's extremely controversial because welfare and subsidies to poor people come from taxes from everybody else. So there's an awful lot of hostility from ordinary taxpayers, and there's a perception that people don't deserve it. When you're doing something like rewarding people for hard work and rewarding people for doing well at school, that's something that is more justifiable. So it's easier to do versus side opposition. Maybe it's harder to have just wide-ranging welfare benefits increased for everybody. But why is this really important? Well, even if we're only increasing it for some families, this makes a massive difference. And I would be arguing that it does things like create the multiplier effect, which is if one family has higher welfare, they have more money to spend, they're going to purchase more things from shops around them, they're going to buy more goods and more services, and that indirectly benefits everyone in their local area because the money cycles through the economy, and so it helps everybody if there's one family that is getting more welfare. The reason that we're making this argument is twofold. Number one, it's just a different type of impact, and it's always good to try and spread our bases in case we lose this clash, the other two clashes. But number two, it helps us to benefit other people, because opposition is going to say this isn't very fair because there are students who don't get the benefit of this policy and that's uneven. But by making this argument that it still benefits the local economy, I think that you can mitigate this by saying they're likely to be indirectly benefited anyway. So I think that that's another strong way that we can extend on-site government. So that's the government case. So what can we do on-site opposition then? The first thing that I would be doing on-site opposition is counterpropping. Now, I don't generally recommend counterpropping, but I think in this case, you really do want to, because it does seem like the status quo is a little bit hard to defend, where site government is giving a bunch of poor families extra money and you're not doing anything. That's going to be a little bit difficult for you to defend. Per the rules of parliamentary debate, you can use the same amount of resources that site government is using for your side. So you can say we would take the same amount of resources and do something else. I would recommend saying something like, we are going to use the same amount of resources to have free school lunches and free school breakfasts, which honestly makes a huge difference to poor kids who mightn't be getting that at home. And that's the number one thing, that it's easier to focus in class if you are well fed and, not hungry. Or for instance, that we would raise the pay of teachers in public schools, which is going to stop the staff shortage and the teaching crisis, which is going to help all students in these schools. I think we could take this counterprop one step further and say that there's a trade-off. So the fact that the government side is increasing welfare for these students who are doing well, I would say that This means that it's less likely that the state can also then pump money into other educational projects that are very, very necessary, because they're already committing a lot of political capital to this, which means that it's less likely that we get these things like pay rises for teachers and so on. And that's really, really bad, because it's the fact that teachers are quitting public schools in droves and going into private schools or tutoring that is causing an academic crisis in public schools. I would also say that it's even potentially likely that the government has to cut money from public schools to pay for this policy, so it actually makes the situation much, much worse. The tip here is, when you're running a counterprop or an alternative, not just to leave it out there in the debate, but to actually show how yours is better and how the other side's policy makes the situation worse comparatively, is just a stronger way to present that counterprop. The second thing that I would say, of course, is that this policy penalizes the less able students. So that's students, for instance, who have a learning disability that makes it harder for them to learn and retain knowledge, or that who are just less academically gifted, and that is a lot of people. But also that you can say as well that there's a lot of students who, it's not their fault, but they might be poorly behaved in class because they're dealing with a lot of stress at home. So there might be violence at home, there might be abuse at home, their parents might even be involved in drugs or alcoholism or gambling or any of these things. And these students tend not to do as well in school, but it's not their fault, and their family should not be penalized for this. And, because yes, the parents are acting badly, but that's hardly the child's fault. And yet when we don't give a family extra welfare, it is the child who ends up suffering. It is the child who, doesn't get their houses kept as warm in the winter, for instance. It's a really, really big issue. It's hard to show that the situation will get worse because of this policy. So we need to make this argument just instead then that we have a moral obligation towards these most vulnerable students. And actually, the students who are doing well at school are probably the ones who are going to be just fine. They're probably maybe going to get scholarships to university. They're probably going to be able to land on their feet and get good jobs because they're thriving in school. So it's these students who are actually doing badly at school that we have the most obligation to help as the government. It's hard to show that this motion makes things worse for them, but we can just say, by using the trade-off that we established in our counterprop, that it is making the situation worse for them, because this policy comes with trade-offs in and of itself. The other thing that I would say is, you could add that this would make incentives worse for parents. And so I would approach this in two ways. Number one is just the standard argument of parents putting pressure on their kids and forcing them to study more and so on. I think that's a very standard argument. We should be able to follow the reasoning for that. And it's just flipping the argument from Gov, which says that you're going to motivate parents by showing that that motivation can be too extreme and actually put too much pressure on the students, who feel like their entire family's financial security is, bearing down on them. And actually that stress can make them do worse in tests because they feel like there's so much pressure on them. So that's definitely a line of argumentation from side opposition. And then the last thing, the unusual third argument. What's the unusual third argument that we could make for opposition? Well, we could say that it creates perverse incentives for parents. And what I mean by this is, side government kind of has to decide, are we giving the parents a large bonus on their welfare or a small bonus on their welfare? If it's a small bonus, well, it mightn't make that much of a difference. But if it's a large bonus, well, then this does actually create large effects, like the trade-off that we talked about earlier. But it also has large effects in terms of how families make decisions. And what do I mean by this? Well, welfare tends to be targeted towards low-income people. So only people who are unemployed or underemployed or really struggling to make ends meet or have a disability and so on. And intuitively, I think that the government team has to defend this type of welfare, which is just targeted towards poor families, because otherwise their policy is justifying paying well-off families, rich families, for the kids getting high scores, which I don't think that they want to defend. So it's probably not a universal policy. It is probably targeted towards poor families. Why does this matter? Well, if welfare is targeted towards poor families, that often means that there's an upper threshold. So there's a certain amount of money that you can make, and then after that, you're no longer eligible for welfare. So if you start getting a medium paid job, a well-paid job, you're no longer eligible for this welfare. However, if your child is now generating a lot of this money for you and bringing money into the household by giving you the stipend because they're doing well in school, to some degree, this might incentivize parents who potentially are worried that if they then get a better job or if they move up the ladder, that they will lose this benefit, that stops them doing things that will be better for their family overall. Like, for instance, pushing themselves to take a night class, pushing themselves to get a training or to get a different type of job. because they're afraid that they would lose this welfare. And that's bad. The reason why that's bad is because welfare is good as a short-term fix, but it's not a really long-term thing that we would suggest for families. And the reason why is, number one, it doesn't help you save for retirement. It's just kind of giving you enough money to survive. But unlike a job, it's not really paying into this kind of long-term fund. Number two, there's no upward growth. So welfare tends to stay the same all the time, versus when you're working in a job, you tend to get a pay rise over time and actually earn more money and get career opportunities and so on, and you get more experience. So we'd much rather that these parents were actually working, but this policy might disincentivize work in weird ways by making parents want to still continue to be eligible for this welfare. Now that only works if the government team are making this welfare means tested, which means it's only targeted at poor families, but I think they have to do that, because if they say that we're going to give it to every single family whose child does well, then I think that's a massive handout for the rich, and you can also hit them on that very hard if that's the stance that they want to take. So overall, we talked a little bit about a model and why that's very important in this debate, and we came up with two sensible arguments for either side and also an unusual argument for either side. And the reason that we want to do that is just to throw our opponents off a little bit and be a little bit harder to predict. Because everyone is operating at the level that you guys are operating at, we know that these simple arguments are more easy to preempt, so it's nice to have some alternatives on the table as well. I hope that was a useful motion analysis for you, and enjoy the rest of the league. Bye!